Hello, everyone, and welcome to a special bonus episode of the Lay of the Land podcast. I am your host, Jeffrey Stern, and today we're going to do something a little bit different as we flip the proverbial script and I step into the role of guest on other podcasts to share some recent developments in my own journey and glimpse into what is coming next. As some of you may know, I recently started a new professional chapter, joining the founding team of the O.H.I.O Fund, and in the near future, I will record a dedicated episode to explore the O.H.I.O Fund in depth with some of my partners. Until then, please join me in these exciting conversations as I share my own insights and stories about transitioning to this new chapter, reflections on building Axuall, Lay of the Land, Cleveland, and a whole lot more. In this specific conversation, I sat down with Paul O'Connor of the Rust Belt Rundown podcast, hosted by Rust Belt Recruiting. We've actually featured Rust Belt Recruiting on Lay of the Land's 180th episode featuring Taylor Evans. So please go check out that episode if you want to hear more about Taylor's journey and Rust Belt Recruiting's story. With that, please enjoy my conversation with Paul O'Connor.
Welcome, everyone, to episode 82 of the Rust Belt Rundown, a production by Rust Belt Recruiting, a regional leader in manufacturing talent acquisition. I'm your host, Paul O'Connor, and on this episode, we are joined by Jeffrey Stern, principal at the O.H.I.O Fund. Jeffrey, welcome to the podcast.
Pleasure to be here. Thank you very much for having me, Paul.
I'm excited. We got a lot of questions. These are more, we usually don't have 12. We'll see if we get through all of them. We usually average around 7 or 8, so we got a lot to get through. I said O.H.I.O. Do you say that, or is it the O.H.I.O Fund?
The O.H.I.O Fund.
Ohio? So that's top of mind for me, obviously, because I live here and people in Ohio are obsessed with saying it.
Yes.
But I was just on a flight. I went to Denver and I came back and we were on Southwest. And Southwest, they have fun, like
they have a lot of fun on Southwest.
They have a lot of fun on Southwest. And I swear to you, the flight attendant must have said OH 30 times. Like legit. By the end, I was like, all right, please, sir, just we got to get off the plane.
We know the destination.
Yeah, we are well aware of where we're going. But let's dive in. We got a lot to talk about. And I want to start with what, at least on the outside looking in, seemed to be a inflection point in your career. And that's going back a couple years now when you joined Venture for America as a fellow. And I want to do two things. One, tell us about that experience. And then two, was it an inflection point? Because this is very much outside looking in. But it also involved a move and somewhat of a shift in what you were doing career-wise. So talk to us about that experience.
Yeah, well, the short of it, and just to introduce, what Venture for America was, for those who may not be familiar, a fellowship founded by Andrew Yang in the spirit of kind of Teach for America, but instead of placing recent college graduates into educational systems in cities across the country, did so from an entrepreneurial perspective, and specifically into cities that what I would call lack the young person gravity of a New York or San Francisco. So places like Cleveland, Pittsburgh, St. Louis, Detroit, Baltimore, where there is a lot going on, but have a bit of that brain drain challenge.
Yeah, I was just going to call. Yep, for sure.
VFA for me was an inflection point. At the time, it actually felt sort of purpose-built and tailor-made to help someone like me navigate the process of figuring out what to do next, as I was entrepreneurially inclined and curious, but I think without the full set of experience or direction or passion about a specific problem to start something myself yet. I came to VFA after what I felt was the spirit of a midlife crisis that I just happened to have experienced after graduating college, which I am grateful to have kind of reconciled with it early in my life. But I came pretty quickly to understand that the well-trodden, prestigious professional paths, while well paid and with all the external markings of success, were likely not the paths that would bring me fulfillment. So I turned inwards, tried to figure out what I wanted to do, and tried to understand what would bring me fulfillment, and came to realize I didn't really know what I wanted to do in a world I didn't really yet understand. And I knew, though, if I proceeded to do what I thought other people expected me to do instead of what I actually wanted to do at a deeper level. Then when things go wrong or they get hard or difficult, which they always do, I would more likely find myself, doubtful, despondent, frozen on the stage of my hypothetical life at that point. And if I could figure out what I love to do, I was quite sure that I could be more resilient in the face of that kind of adversity. So the challenge was that I didn't know what I wanted to do, but I did know what I didn't want to do. Mm-hmm. So the internal compass that I use as a proxy to try and help guide me down this path was my curiosity. So I wanted to learn as much as I possibly could at the highest velocity I possibly could. And I came to believe that the best career decision I could make was to take on this kind of career risk before I actually had a career to risk. And the best way I had learned how to learn was in practice, taking on as much ownership, accountability, and responsibility as I could with the most frequent feedback loops. And my intuition was that building something, entrepreneurship, was the best way to do that. And so Venture for America was really this kind of graceful bridge into this world of entrepreneurship that it was my intuition would be the fastest way for me to learn about what it was that I thought I was interested in.
There's a lot to unpack there. Again, are we going to get through all 12? I don't know. But I want to go back to, your quote unquote midlife crisis early.
Yes, my quarter life crisis.
Your quarter life crisis, and I don't, graduated from Cornell. We probably should have mentioned that. Obviously, top 10, top 15, depending on what list you look at, university in the country. What is your advice to people that may experience that may graduate and say, oh, no, I actually really don't know which direction I want to go in? And you said frozen, despondent, right? Like those are the feelings that people get if they go down the path that you mentioned, right? Like the logo, you go work at, I don't know, the big four or Google, whichever way you're going. What is your recommendation or advice to people that may go through that early in their career, like you did?
Yeah, it's tricky, especially at institutions like that where, I don't know, my old English teacher, Mr. Fisher, had expressed this concept to me that is still with me today, which is that, we all got, in that kind of environment, very good at what he called hoop jumping, where, enthusiastically, very competitively in those environments, you would demonstrate getting good grades, doing the extracurriculars, doing the right kind of volunteer and philanthropic work, to ultimately try and attend a well-regarded college, build your credentials to try and get the, prestigious professional management consultant or investment banking job or, whatever it may be.
Yep.
And I mean, literally all I did was a bit of a thought of experiment of, I had a sense for bits and pieces of what those kinds of professions felt like through software development, through investment banking. And I just played out, what would it be like to do this for the next 10, 15 years? And it was just I couldn't paint a sufficiently compelling, vision for myself. And I felt if I couldn't convince myself of it, then I was doing it to appease the expectations of other people, that was not a good enough reason to do it.
Yeah.
And so I really wanted to, first and foremost, be able to convince myself it was the thing that I actually wanted to do. Mm-hmm. And it brings me back to this, take the career risk before you have a career to risk. At the onset, there's no shame. There's really no drawback to just trying as many things as you possibly can and using your curiosity as that compass to guide you through things that you might enjoy doing.
Yep. I love it. Let's stay on curiosity as a compass. Big news, the launch of the O.H.I.O fund, for our listeners that may not be aware of the inspiration to start this, as well as, the fund itself, what you guys are funding, how it all works. Give us the full rundown of what the last couple months have looked like for you and the team.
Yeah, so it's very exciting. We have officially launched the fund with a first close of $108 million to invest. At its core, the way that I think about it is the O.H.I.O fund is an impact fund that is seeking to invest in compelling and high growth opportunities that are centered around the future and present of Ohio's economy. So we can talk about a few pieces of that, but the premise, if you believe that Ohio is well positioned to benefit from certain structural trends over the coming years, the coming decades, and we can unpack what some of those trends might be. But if you take that premise, then the O.H.I.O fund is what we are building to ensure that we can actually fund and invest in the set of opportunities that would allow Ohio to realize that potential. Because it's really not a given that all this progress will just happen on its own, left to its own volition, even with the tailwinds of these trends. And so you actually need a catalytic force, activation energy to take these companies, institutions, people locally who can actually make it happen and invest in them. And the O.H.I.O fund is that activation energy. It is that catalyst. So the O.H.I.O fund is, I would say, opportunistic in that we will invest in all the opportunities we come across tied to their economic and regional impact within Ohio. So the fund actually draws much of its inspiration from a firm called Temasek, which is a firm that originally started 50 years ago back in Singapore and took this place-based opportunistic approach to helping Singapore invest in a broad set of holdings, which at its inception was something like a steel mill, an airline, which today is Singapore Airlines, a hotel, a shoemaker. So things that were strategically important to the economic and financial state of Singapore, but at the same time was not limited to traditional venture capital. There was new business formation, there was real estate, there was infrastructure, with the thread that tied it all together being to the benefit of Singapore. So today, Temasek is a $400 billion fund. And that model is one that has never really been emulated before. I mean, certainly within the United States, but it is the exact model that we're trying to emulate here in Ohio.
I really appreciated the fact that you said, Ohio in 2024, and certainly, dating as far back as you really want to go, but I would say since probably 2000, the last 24 years, and look, I'm in Columbus, and so, Columbus gets, fair or not, a lot of the press, or a lot of the hype around the O.H.I.O train, if you will. Although we don't have trains, you guys do. But I'm curious.
I wish we did, though.
Oh my, please! It's going to be really. I hope you can make that happen somehow. But that idea of like the force, right? The catalytic force behind it's not a given that Ohio will continue, or any state. Pick any region or any state, Charlotte or Austin or whatever, that they will continue on that track. And so my question to you is, are there what opportunities do you see specifically in Ohio that people may be overlooking right now that are just not on the radar?
Yeah, well, I think I can speak to some of what those structural trends are, because I think within that, cover some of the things that may or may not be on people's minds when they think about, I mean, for one, what is the opportunity set, but certainly what we're thinking about at the O.H.I.O fund. And it kind of ties into the whole thesis and the way we've thought about it. But, some of those trends that I found interesting as they relate to Ohio, but much in the way that I mentioned earlier, where I tried to convince myself of what the sufficiently compelling, thing is. And I couldn't do it for investment banking at the time.
Mhm.
I before every job that I've ever had, I've tried to convince myself. And when I did that for the Ohio Fund, I thought about what these trends were. And you have kind of a broad set of things like this desire for domestic, secure, and robust supply chains. That's kind of come into the zeitgeist of recent. You have this infusion of software and automation into hardware. So, people in the venture world talk about bits and atoms and kind of the collision of those two things. You have politically and at a macroeconomic level, these incentives from the IRA and the CHIPS Act, specifically to reshore and develop manufacturing competencies locally.
Mhm.
You have kind of this mass proliferation of demand for electricity that is even tied into the kind of exponential growth of AI and our desire to build semiconductor chips, modules, all the related microelectronic components, and the energy needed to power those and data centers. And then kind of holistically, even from a defense perspective, this kind of imperative to secure strategic independence, considering, the political environment we're in and security vulnerabilities that may exist within products manufactured outside of America. And I think maybe even more importantly, our dependence on other regions for critical technologies that we actually need here locally. And so those are the kinds of things that when I think about Ohio and tailwinds that we have, again, it's not a given that Ohio will just be able to run with those. But if you did this experiment of, 5, 10, 20 years from now, what are the set of things that you would need to invest in to support locally to ensure that Ohio could actually benefit from those trends? Those are the kinds of things that I'm very excited for the Ohio Fund to be able to invest in.
I want to go back to, you mentioned, am I pronouncing it right? Temasek?
Yeah.
Fund? Okay. I want to go back to that. I was, you mentioned that there was not another fund like Temasek in the States and that it is a, place-based investment model. Why hasn't that been replicated? Clearly, I don't know what the starting figure was, but the ending figure or current figure is 400 billion. Hard to argue that that's not success. Why hasn't that been replicated? And why was that the model you wanted to go after or replicate, I should say?
Well, I think there's something to the opportunistic nature of it. I mean, part of it is because it's hard. When you think about, traditional venture capital fund or a private equity fund or a real estate fund, the limiting reagent, the constraint that you're putting on yourself is the kind of asset that you're able to invest in. And typically the limiting factor is not a geography. In fact, that's often considered maybe even a detriment if you were to apply that to a specific asset class. But I think what is really compelling about what Temasek did, what the Ohio Fund is aiming to do, is our ability to bring together the state, I mean, really at a state level with representation in Cleveland and Columbus and Cincinnati across, the founding team of the Ohio Fund, this really formidable group of people, both from our investor base and the kind of respective networks that we have to corral folks to invest and support and bring to fruition these set of opportunities that probably wouldn't have happened otherwise. So, the kinds of things that we might be able to do are things that a venture fund, a real estate fund, a private equity fund focused just on Ohio couldn't do on their own. Mm-hmm. And so it is kind of the broadness of the assets that we're able to invest in that will allow us, I think, to do something similar. And the requisite ingredient, I think, is actually the founding team of the Ohio Fund. That it's Ray Leach, who ran Jumpstart in Cleveland for the last 20 years. That it's Mark Kwame, who is really the one who spearheaded Jobs Ohio and founded Drive Capital in Columbus. that it's Mike Venerable who's ran Cincy Tech for the same amount of time that Ray has run Jumpstart, and that it's Jill Meyer who ran the Chamber of Commerce down in Cincinnati as well. I mean, that group of people and their respective networks and our collective ability to rally, people who, like you mentioned at the beginning of our conversation, people love Ohio to a degree that, like, I'm from New York City. People love New York, but like not like people love Ohio. There's this crazy energy that I think we can. That's certainly expressed, but I think latent from a business perspective that we can tap into.
Yep. Yeah. I grew up in the Connecticut, New York area, so I'm right there with you. My first experience was I went to school at OU, and that was my first taste of the pride, right? That the state has. Okay, so let's dive into this term or this concept of an industrial renaissance in Ohio. Talk to us about a little bit about what you mean by that, and particularly what industries or advancements you think will play a pivotal role in the industrial renaissance here in Ohio.
Yeah, so I love this concept of the industrial renaissance in Ohio. I love reading generally, but there's a specific book called the Ohio Guide, which has been one of my favorite books of recent, that kind of details in the holistic story of Ohio from pre-inception to the 1940s. And I think that the context that is important to consider here is the historical one, because in the span of a long but single lifetime, Ohio underwent really a crazy set of transformations, from natural wilderness, which really is where it was at the founding of the state, to an actual industrial force through successive waves of technological innovation that each in their own reshape the whole state's economic landscape. So the early 1800s saw the rise of steam power and our ability to navigate the canals, which was completely rendered useless by the time of the 1840s and 50s when the railroads came around. And the railroads laid the groundwork, I mean, literally, for this era of unprecedented manufacturing might within Ohio, where Ohio emerged as this leader and builder of things. I mean, really, as on a global level, the epicenter of oil, home to the greatest iron port, arguably in the world, producer of half of the world's rubber, a leader in steel production. So when I think about this industrial renaissance, it's hearkening to that spirit of, I mean, not just Ohio, really the Midwest, but specifically here in Ohio, that building of things mentality. And I think this moment where we are today, really reinforced with the perspective we have in the wake of COVID, right, stems from a renewed appreciation I think people have for the know-how and the capacity to actually build things better, faster, cheaper, and goes back to a lot of the structural trends that I mentioned before, that it's as much a strategic initiative at this point to develop those competencies locally. And so to me, that's kind of the spirit of the industrial renaissance that I think we actually are experiencing.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to argue. I mean, you mentioned the CHIPS Act, and obviously you live down here, like Intel. You can't go without talking about it.
Yeah.
But there's more, right? Like, I think the exciting part about, I mean, look, Intel is historic. It's the biggest investment they've made in, I think, their company history. in terms of like a new area and chips and all of that. But what comes along with an Intel is almost as important, right? All of the other brands, other organizations, other companies, the infrastructure to just flat out build everything. So yeah, I mean, it's an exciting time to be in the state. It's an exciting time to be in one of the three C's or Dayton. And so I want to piggyback off that. I can't imagine how long it took you to get to this announcement. Probably the last year and change, I am assuming, of getting the fund in order and the people and the team and all of that. Mm-hmm. Are you able to share some of either the projects or organizations or people or things that you guys are funding right now or are planning on? Are you able to share any of that yet? Is that public knowledge?
Our first deal is,
okay.
And the rest we could paint in broad strokes, but are really all tied to the structural trends. Those are the kinds of things that we're interested in. But at the highest level, the fund, again tethered to Ohio, it's hard to forget in the name. Will invest directly into later stage companies in the space, kind of in the way that people might think more like a venture capital firm would, but also has the ability to do this real estate infrastructure and even fund investment, much in the way Temasek had. So the first deal that we actually did was the purchase of 148 acres of land in Sunbury, Ohio, in the business and technology park there, which is about 20 miles north of, and in collaboration with the New Albany Land Company's new industrial park, where, as you mentioned already, the Intel chip plants are going, and which is actually proximate to the AEP power station that is supplying, electricity to the area. So I think in the first few deals, we're trying to be quite intentional about demonstrating the ability we have to do things that wouldn't otherwise have been invested in traditional models. So the collaboration with the New Albany Land Company, and demonstrating, that kind of capability is one thing that's kind of important, so that we can speak to practically things we've done rather than hypothetically things we want to do is important with these first few deals. And also really core to it is, you mentioned this kind of gravity around Columbus. We are trying to be quite intentional that roughly 25% of the fund will go to the Northeast Ohio region, 25% of the fund to the greater Columbus region, 25% of the fund to the region around Cincinnati, and 25% of the fund across the rest of the state. So, a few axes we're keeping track of, but we want in the first few deals to also reflect that desire to spread the allocation of capital in its deployment.
It's interesting. Are those hard and steady goals, or can they shift based on need, opportunity, project?
Yeah, I think directionally those are what we're going to do. Again, the fund being opportunistic in nature, I don't think we would turn down investing into Cincinnati twice over if we didn't have a Cleveland deal in between. But directionally, that it is absolutely, we want it to be representative and investing across the state.
So let's switch gears a little bit. You are a podcast host yourself, the Lay of the Land podcast. You started about 4 years ago in 2020, I believe. Before I get to some of the stories that you've been able to tell and people and organizations that you highlighted, what was the motivation or inspiration to start it?
Yeah. So after my Venture for America experience, I knew at that point with a greater degree of certainty that I did actually like entrepreneurship, but I still did not know what I wanted to build. And so what I set out to do was to meet as many founders in the greater Cleveland area as I possibly could over the summer of 2019. So I probably connected with about 70 founders that summer and CEOs in Cleveland, all of whom said yes, to a pretty much stranger reaching out from a place of curiosity. And it's probably the reason I'm still here. So I'm grateful for that Midwestern, kindness and warmth. But I observed a few things in talking to these folks about who they were as people, what motivated them, what inspired them to go out and try and solve whatever problem it was that they built a company to solve, and some of the tactics of company building. And the kind of patterns of observation that were interesting to me were that most of these people did not know who each other were, which was kind of, I thought, surprising. Yeah. Most Clevelanders did not know who the Cleveland founders were. And again, many of these folks have built, $100 million top line organizations. They're, everything from seed stage to public company CEOs and founders. And the complete dearth of media coverage of any of them. And I was pretty confident, again, coming from New York City and having a lot of friends in the startup worlds in San Francisco, in Boston, and kind of the larger cities, that had any of these people been there, the TechCrunch, Wired, VC, media mechanism would have been amplifying their work and celebrating it. Both in success and in the trials and tribulations of, maybe even the ones that didn't have the great outcome. And in parallel, I was co-founding my own company at that time, Axuall, which was in the healthcare space in Cleveland, which is still around today. We've since, raised about $40 million for it. It's on a good track. But the thing that I had learned, one of the explicit things I had learned through my Venture for America experience was that it's certainly very hard to build a company. And from the founder and CEO perspective, it's lonely. And that to have a support network, a peer group of folks outside of your specific company that you can talk to, who can actually empathize with what it is you're going through, is really important. And so the podcast came from a place of wanting to build cohesion amongst the founder community in Cleveland in a way that I was surprised didn't really exist already, and to amplify the stories of people that, genuinely were inspiring to me, and many of whom I think have been on this podcast, and many others who, so as I came to appreciate the Midwestern warmth and kindness, the third characteristic is this humility. And I really appreciate it, but I've come to think and feel that the downside to it is the lack of celebration of excellence and wins, and like truly inspirational things and success. And so the podcast was my attempt to amplify those stories in a way that, I have no qualms about doing, because I think they're worth celebrating and amplifying.
Are there any stories, people, organizations that stand out or are particularly memorable? And, were there any lessons that you learned from those conversations? I'm sure that there's a ton of lessons, so I'll try.
How many podcasts do you want to do here? We could do 200 episodes worth of podcasts on that. Just that.
It was too broad.
But no, there are some that are just top of mind. So I'm baseline. The podcast is the greatest learning vehicle I have ever come across outside of trying to build a company myself. I'm sure maybe you feel similar about that. Awesome. It's like, from this selfishly, it's the greatest thing that I did not expect to be a consequence of it, but is really a gift on the other side of it. And there are really too many memorable stories. But I was just working on editing this one, so it's top of mind. But so I had Fred DeSanto on the podcast, who's the CEO of Ancora here in Cleveland, which is just about a $10 billion investment fund. And he talked about his philosophy around giving without expectation of anything in return, and the dot connecting idea of like making these really superlative introductions, this whole kind of pay it forward mentality, giving without expectation of return. And that one has resonated because it has come up so many times across dozens of the conversations I've had, that it's like been reinforced as important. And it's a mentality that I certainly try and practice in the community building side of the work I'm doing with Lay of the Land now.
Interesting. The document, yeah, I mean, that's a hard thing to convince people of. You know, I'm in fundraising, I'm in philanthropy, and there are some people that believe in philanthropy and there are some people that don't. And so it's hard. What I'm trying to get at is we don't spend as much time. Our organization doesn't spend as much time because there's not enough time in the day to convince someone of the power of philanthropy, because there are enough people that believe in it and we need to be meeting with anyway. And so this question's not on here, but you know, that message, that mantra, that belief was passed on to you through this one episode. And, you know, I'm making an assumption through a variety of conversations.
Many. Yeah.
Yeah. Kind of like you referred to. How have you been able to pass that message or ethos or belief onto people in your life, whether it's family or friends or partners or even the team that you've worked with or companies? Like, how have you specifically been able to do that? And maybe it is just action, right? You know, sometimes it's lead by example, but I'm curious to see how you've been able to pass that along. It's not easy.
Yeah, it's not easy. I mean, my intuition was that was the right thing to do. I don't know where that intuition came from, but and so I didn't have a good, you know, quantifiable justification for it. But I can tell you, over the many years of doing the podcast now and having been able to facilitate, I mean, literally many hundreds of introductions for people within the podcast community that's been built, who I just felt should meet each other.
Mm-hmm.
Many hundreds of introductions later, I have seen, I mean, literally companies formed, companies funded, people hired, friends that have been made, sales that have happened, all of which in, you know, retrospect could identify the introduction as like the origination moment for that thing. And
yeah, how powerful is that? I mean, it's amazing.
And it's so personally fulfilling, you know, for me. And so that's like the truth is like the giving without expectation of return is there, but it brings me such joy and happiness knowing now what the power and importance of those introductions can make for someone in their life and their professional journey, that I'm just so happy to do it all the time whenever I feel that there are people that should connect. And, you know, and sometimes I don't even hear about what the consequences of an introduction are for, you know, many months, even years later. And the reality is I've probably only heard of a few, because most people don't, you know, and it's hard to remember to like close the communication loop. And so I'm quite sure that there have been far more, you know, interesting consequences, and other people who have since introduced each other to people because of this that I don't even know about. But that pay it forward mentality, I don't need any convincing of anymore, because I've seen it work, and that's like sufficiently convincing for me.
So we'll wrap up with this one question, and then we'll hit the rapid fire. I think it attempts to close the loop on this. But you mentioned the humility of people in the Midwest and Ohio. You mentioned, you know, the lack of maybe celebrating the successes and the wins and things like that. Do you think at all that hampers or I don't want to say slows down, but let's say prevents the speed of something. It could be going 100 mile an hour, but because maybe of humility and lack of success, maybe it's only going to go 70. Do you think that hurts Ohio? Part one, and or Midwest, I think we'll focus on Ohio. And then two, what strategies can someone like you or a fund like the Ohio Fund take in nurturing the entrepreneurial spirit with a little bit more? It's okay to, puff out your chest every now and again. It's all right. Right? You don't need, right. No one's trying to keep some humbleness for sure. But I don't know. Those are the kind of the two questions we'll wrap up with, and then we'll jump into the rapid fire.
Right. Somewhere between the two extremes of John D. Rockefeller, who, by the way, built Standard Oil here in Ohio, and the humility that we have today is to me where the healthy medium is, because I think on either side there are challenges, and the challenge on being too modest, and kind of humble, and this is another theme that's kind of come up in a series of conversations through the podcast over the years, is a downstream second order consequence of it is like there's a tolerance for complacency to a degree. And I think, it depends what your priorities and your values are and what you're actually trying to accomplish. But I personally am motivated to help people elevate their ambition and what the bar for excellence is, and understanding that you don't have to, tolerate less in a lot of ways. And so, that's my personal feel. But I think a lot of that has just come from, I've gotten to see a lot of places around the world. I grew up in New York, and I've been very privileged and fortunate to travel. And there's this Mark Twain quote that always comes to mind, that travel is basically fatal to prejudice and narrow-mindedness. And if you are to kind of develop a charitable and wholesome interpretation of people and of things, you can't just, vegetate in your corner of the world. You have to actually go and see things. And I feel lucky to have been able to see things. But with that has come, not just a perspective of, the things that are out there, but of different cultures and of how people think about things. And it's tricky, because I really never mean to impose anything on anyone else, but I know what is out there and like what people could achieve. And it even goes back to the Ohio Fund. It's very much, I think there's a real opportunity in this place, in the people here, and I'd like to do what I can to help unlock the latent potential within. And so if anything, I think it's not a complete barrier, the modesty to it, but I don't think it helps. It doesn't help either all the time.
Yeah, the way you put the tolerance for complacency, that's a really interesting perspective on it. And like you said, a downstream effect, right? Like almost as if, well, this is how it's always been, and so this is how it will be. And it's like actually the opposite, right? Actually, it can be someone built whatever this is all made up. We all did this. People before us.
And again, Rockefeller on the other side of it is probably too extreme in his
Yes.
But sure. I think there's probably a healthy medium.
There's a healthy medium. Jeffrey, this has been great, man. We're going to get you out of here on some rapid fire. I think we could probably talk for another hour, so we'll try and find another time for you to come back on in a couple months or next year and kind of check in on everything. But we always end with the same 5 questions. As fast as you get the answer in your head, you spit it back my way. But first question: best piece of advice you've ever received?
Yeah, the quick rapid fire. It's not normally how my brain works. The best pieces of advice I've received, I think, have predominantly come from my mom. The one that comes to mind at the moment is to leave things better than you found them.
Yep. And I think it's funny what, I'm sure she said that to you years ago, maybe when you were young or middle school or high school, and like, look at what you're doing, right? Like, you are attempting to leave the place you are better than you found it. So kudos to your mom. Worst piece of advice you've ever received?
Yeah, I try to not keep bad advice in my mind, so it's hard to recall.
It could always be a generic one too, right? Like, I don't know. So, there's a lot of generic advice out there that just does not apply to everyone by any means.
Yeah, let's see. There's like a lot of conventional wisdom that I don't think is of wisdom anymore.
Yeah.
Like, no one ever got fired for IBM may not, apply anymore. So some things like that.
Okay. Next one, best or favorite book you've ever read?
Oh, again, an impossible question. I think like advice, books resonate at different frequencies at different points in your life, depending on what you're feeling. I'll tell you, I recently reread Animal Farm by George Orwell, and I'll tell you that resonates much more strongly today than it did when I read it in middle school.
I was going to say, when did we have to read that?
Yeah, but that would not be my favorite, although it is excellent. Orwell is quite a writer. Favorite across time. I'm often drawn back to the Stoic writers, and I often revisit Seneca on the shortness of life.
This is my daily read. I read this every single morning.
There it
is. At
least
1 or 2 pages. All right, we'll get you out of here with this. This is sometimes / most of the time the hardest question our guests get, and that is free publicity for restaurants in Cleveland. What are your go-to spots? Favorite restaurants? Breakfast, lunch, dinner, snacks, post Guardian game? What do you got?
It's easy for me. The answer is Mitchell's.
Oh, okay.
Mitchell's ice cream. Best ice cream. That's it. That does it for me. That's the reason I'm still here in Ohio.
Mitchell's ice cream. Wow, that's the strongest endorsement I think we've got. As another New Yorker, I'm very jealous of Cleveland from a pizza perspective because Columbus pizza is truly awful. There are 3 spots maybe that you can go to, and they all cut their pieces in little like squares. They put 4,000 pieces of pepperoni on them. They just have no idea.
It is tough to get a slice in Cleveland, but I'll plug El Rion as well.
Listen, if you think it's tough up there, stay because it's harder down here. Okay, it's harder down here. El Rion, what's it called?
El Rion.
El Rion.
ILRIONE.
Okay, El Rion and Mitchell's. So you got a slice and a cone for post Guardians or I think the Guardians are first in the AL East. I don't know if you're or AL, I should say. I don't know if you're a baseball guy, but they're having a hell of a year. I just learned.
It's very possible. I'll be honest in that. I thought I liked sports growing up in New York, and then when I got to Ohio, I was like, I actually don't.
Actually,
not to the degree that people here love sports.
Yeah. Well, Jeffrey, thank you again for coming on, man. Really appreciate it. And, we wish you and the team best of luck with everything this year and beyond. But we'll definitely have you on again soon.
Thank you. I really appreciate the opportunity. And it's, I feel like we're kindred podcasts, in a lot of ways. So it's fun to be on my fraternal show here.
Yep, absolutely. All right, man. We'll talk with you soon. Thank you again.
Thank you.
Thanks for tuning into this episode of the Rust Belt Rundown.